Hello everybody, smakelijk and welcome to this lunch discussion on ethical behavior in the context of research collaborations with our partners in lower and middle income countries. My name is Roeland Jansen, work at the International Office, coordinating the Global Minds program. And this Global Minds program is a program funded by Vlieg-EOS, maybe known by some of you. And it aims to strengthen our university in its ambitions, its actions related to global development. And one of the main instruments of this ambition is with us here in the room. It's our advisory board, our external advisory board. Maybe you can raise your hands a bit. 7 academics, they did their PhDs at KU Leuven, and now they join us once every year for a week to discuss all kinds of topics related to global developments and the policy that we at KU Leuven are making in this topic. So we're very happy to have them. That's also what we will be doing today, listening to their perspective, trying to learn from it. We have at the table Professor Tamuka Niwatiwa from the University of Zimbabwe, one of the members at the board. He will share some of the insights that came out of some discussions this week. And here, Emeritus Professor Roel Merks, President of the Interfaculty Council for Global Development at KU Leuven, and will take the position of the KU Leuven in this matter. And what is the matter that we will be discussing? We came across a document that is called the Global Code of Conduct for Research in Resource-Poor Settings. It contains 23 articles on ethical research behavior under 4 big headings: fairness, respect, care, and honesty. They are articles like local communities and research participants should be included throughout the entire research process, or local researchers should be included also in the study design, study implementation, data ownership, intellectual property, and authorship of publications, or that it's important that feedback about the findings of the research must be given back to local communities and research participants. 23 articles in this sense that are specifically focusing on the types of research collaborations we have at KU Leuven with our partners in low and middle income countries as we do today. The creation of this code, this document, maybe I have it here, that's what it looks like. It's a really short document, with 23 articles that are easy to read. It was funded by the European Commission, the creation of the code, and carried out under the coordination of the University of Central Lancashire with a large group of stakeholders, a consortium that is called TRUST, with the footnote Equitable Research Partnerships. It was then also adopted by the European Commission for all their calls for funding, and by some other institutions. In Flanders, it's the University of Ghent and Institute of Tropical Medicine who have at this point adopted the code. And our initial question for the board, and that we are also thinking about at policy level, is as a university, as KU Leuven, would we like to adopt this code as well? And what would it mean to adopt it? What would the concrete actions be to do this? Professor Merks will say a bit about communication we had with the lead author of the code that should clarify this a little bit. And I think that, give me the opportunity to pass the floor to our speakers, and to start perhaps with Professor Merks. So the floor is yours.
Thank you, Roeland. Good morning, noon, afternoon, whatever it is in your country. It's not very clear what this meeting is all about, apart that it is about the code of conduct, but what the aims of the meeting are, because the risk is very often that in a meeting like this, we would preach for the already converted. I think if I look who is here around the table, that all of you will already adopt a code like that and would agree with what is in the code. But anyway, where did it start? As Roeland was saying, he was contacted by the University of Lancashire with a letter, and I will read part of it to you to see what we are up to. Dear Mr. Janssen, it is with great pleasure that I'm sending you a letter with information about the adoption of the Global Code of Conduct for Research in Resource-Poor Settings, in my capacity as its lead author. You can find further information on our website, and there's a very nice website with very short and information-full YouTube films. This is the way how it goes these days. And there you can see what it is all about, if you would not be aware of it already. Important for us is actually that some institutions contact me when they have already decided that they will adopt the code. This was the case, as Roland was already mentioning, for instance, for Nature Portfolio, Ghent University, one of our colleague universities. I was hesitating a little to use the right word, and the Polish Science Center. Others contact me when they are still in the process of deciding whether adoption is appropriate for them. And then it comes, in my view, it would be highly commendable for KU Leuven to adopt, as you have a considerable number of courses and research groups that deal with development and North-South collaborations. And then he mentions that also the NWO, but that's a Dutch organization for research funding, is one of the adopters, as is the European Commission, which means that you have to adhere to the code for all your EC funding and for some calls of NWO funding anyway. I'm not sure how serious that is, whether it's really already an obligation from EU funding. Maybe the Vice Rector knows more about it, but it is something that this meeting is all about. Is what is coming out from this meeting, is it going to help us in the deciding or designing a new policy that, for instance, at IRMO, the IRMO, of which I am the chair, that we would already have to look at when you guys are submitting proposals for PhD work or for any other research activity in the South, whether we can already use it internally as a tool or not, and in any way reflect on what it is all about. And for those of you who are not familiar, it is just about doing research in conditions that are totally different than from what we know here. There is usually, or very often, a big difference in resource availability, in knowledge, there's a difference in culture, and it may lead to problems if you're ignorant about it. I know that these days most of the proposals that we carry out are already starting with a participatory approach, which is already one thing, but there is a lot more that is in this code of conduct that it is always good to keep in mind. So with that, I think I can leave it open or pass the floor to our colleague from the advisory board who has thoughts from the South about it.
Okay. Yes, thank you very much. Thank you for all attending. Yes, as he has introduced, I think in the context of research partnerships and collaborations between what you might call high-income countries or low-medium-income countries or resource-poor settings, depending on the definitions you want to use. Obviously, certain issues come up in terms of the power asymmetries that exist, in terms of who has the funding and who has the say on what needs to be done. And at the end of that collaboration, what is the outcomes of that? I mean, what are the outcomes that come from this work that has been done? And what does it actually mean for the recipients or the participants in the Global South who have been partners within the projects? So I think from our perspective as the advisory board, we'll give our feedback towards the end so that we don't preempt our discussions. We feel this is a very important step from people who are coming from the South. We feel this is an important step towards addressing certain imbalances that have existed. And I can actually say that with globalization and changes that are taking place in this century, there are certain feelings that, of course, there is unfairness and things are not turning out the way everybody would want in terms of research partnerships. So the world is changing. So gone are the days when things were more or less one-sided. With media, international communication, there's now increased awareness about the need, to ensure that there's fairness in the way things are done. So this also touches on research. So we feel this is a good initiative. It's a good starting step. How it's going to be implemented, well, I think this is for us to discuss this afternoon. We want to capture as many views as possible from this audience, even from your own experiences, perhaps so that we can guide the international development team at this university on how they can proceed with this kind of policy. In terms of its implementation, is this something that is implementable? What are the pitfalls? We want to hear this from you. So we'll not be doing much talking from the front here until towards the end. So we want to open the floor to you all. Just feel free to start from wherever you want to start. And you can make your contribution and then we take it from there.
Yeah, to add on that, maybe the best known example of where things are potentially going wrong is what is termed helicopter research. Scientists from the north fly to the south, do surveys, they question a lot of people, and then they take all the data, go back to the north, write nice papers on which they are promoted, and the people from which the resources are drawn in terms of information, sometimes also samples, etc., are just left behind. So that's one example that is in the code of conduct that is actually not right. So that if you adhere to the code of conduct, this should not happen any longer. But it is, of course, everybody here would say, yeah, of course, that's normal, you don't do this, but it is very often very tempting to do. If you go and work in a country where the legislations with respect to, for instance, working with animals is different, where the legislation towards environmental care are different, etc., etc. So you can do things in the south sometimes that you would never be allowed to do here. And this is what the code is saying, this should go. This is not acceptable. If you go and work with people in the south, first you have to work together, you have to restitute everything that you find, you have to work together, write papers together, and of course you do the work just as if it was going to happen here in Europe or Belgium or whatever. So just to illustrate a little what this is all about.
If there are questions or comments?
Seems to be cultural and value differences between countries on the one hand, and on the other hand saying if we go to such a country then we have to impose our values for work that we do there. Now, to just draw it out of the imbalance of power, I give the example of the United States. Okay, you could say that Europe and the United States is also a bit of an imbalance, but at least it's more balanced. For a while, stem cell research was deemed unethical in the United States, whereas in Europe it was deemed ethical. So who is now the superior position? And what do you do? I mean, there were people from the United States who are actually coming to Europe to do research exactly like you described, because they could escape the local regulations. So should we prohibit these research from even coming here? Should we impose this? So I think if you recognize there are cultural differences, that has to also filter down to the level of different regulations, and therefore differences in what you can do and how you should approach things in different countries.
I think what is there is the example that you're describing would certainly not be acceptable, because even if a US citizen comes to do stem cell research here, it is not acceptable in his country, so there is already a disconnect between the two legislations. That should not be good. There should be an agreement between the partners about what needs to be done, what can be done. And so in this example, it's clearly that there is kind of escape from the United States to actually do the research in a country where it is allowed. And these are the things that are actually in this code not considered as kosher. But so the importance is to have an agreement between all the project partners on what is going to be done. And if it's in different countries, I think it also addresses the issue of it should be acceptable for the laws in the respective countries. That's my interpretation, at least. Maybe it's a bit more sophisticated than that, but.
Understand correctly. You have similar positions than the European Union. That means the project has to be built ethics by design. That is a good point. And now, if you propose a project to the European Union, has to be ethics by design. That means inside the project has to follow the ethics principles of the European Commission. That means the European Union. That means that the project has to follow all human rights convention, etc., and at least the project to be realized on the south or on China or States, the project has to be acceptable on the line of on the line of the European law, and at the same time, at least of a level of a national law of one country at the European Union. That means that every university follows that if they want to get or participate in a project of the European Union. It could be fine. I don't know. The case of the States remains for me. It's important, I suppose. Thank you.
Emphasis here is on the resource poor settings. I think this is where this global code of conduct is coming up. Well, I don't know how it would apply in countries where they're almost at par, say the EU and the United States. But here we are talking about, focusing on that, because I think there's already a European Union document that deals with that. But then this is now something that has been added for adoption, because I think they felt that it was not adequately addressed as a specific area where you've got to do research in regions where they are, they're highly disadvantaged, and you are coming with your resources. I think that's the comment I have.
Maybe if I can ask.
Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, I just wanted to kind of respond because I had an example which is maybe more in a North-South collaborative framework. So I'm an Indian researcher. I study plant biotechnology, and we work on GMOs, mainly with partners in Africa and India. And we often have this issue where this code would kind of inhibit a lot of our research, because releasing GMOs in many contexts in Europe is considered unethical or is strictly regulated. But at the scientific level, there is a very strong consensus internationally that these rules in the European level are not really scientifically based. And then how do we deal with that fact when researchers in my country, in India or in Africa, want this research, want to do this research, but then if we have a rule that says because Europe doesn't allow it, we shouldn't do it in countries that really want it either, how do we navigate that tension?
Me, I think those things can be managed if it's acceptable in, I don't know, for instance, in Kenya to release GMOs, but not in Europe. It is about releasing GMOs in Kenya. I think there would be, I'm not a lawyer, but I think they are usually flexible and inventive enough to find a solution for situations like that. But I see the tension, it's the complexity.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, a couple of things that I would like to bring into the discussion. First, when preparing for this this event, I noticed that the document already dates from 2018, and that there seems to be a kind of slow response to that. I don't know what the reason is for that, so maybe somebody knows more about that and can clarify. On the other hand, I think it's an interesting document, and it probably adheres to many of the things that we are striving for at this university in collaborating between our research groups and Global South partners. I think what really makes it different, and this is probably what is important in this discussion about European values, our ethics that we set, that it explicitly in one of the articles calls for respect for the local ethics, which could be different from what we experience in Europe and we see as global standards, but from our perspective, and that's not necessarily the only perspective and therefore not necessarily the right perspective. So Article 11, if I may cite, says researchers from high income settings should show respect to the host country research ethics committees. So that's kind of adhering not only to what we find important from our funding agencies, but also adhering to what we do with our partner institutions. So I think it's kind of self-evident that we do that if we want to have collaborations on equal footing with our South partners. So in that sense, I think it goes beyond what we have as European ethics values and that we have to adhere to when using European funding, or Belgian, Flemish funding when ethics when we use our funding, and goes beyond that. And for me, it's a natural step to take.
If I may just give one example. So we had a collaboration with a group in Algeria. As part of a PhD thesis study, the student carried out some animal experiments under the local conditions. She cannot get this work published because the publishers ask for this number, this approval number from an ethics committee. There is not even an ethics committee for animal experiments in their area. So, I mean, is this cultural imperialism? Are we imposing these rules because these are the rules here? And if there is no similar institution or regulation or pathway in another country, then do we have to first require that they establish one to our satisfaction before they can even do any research? I mean, it seems like if you really push this far enough, it becomes quite counterproductive for the countries that they say are already at a power imbalance. So I think this may risk to even make the imbalance worse rather than improve things.
Yeah, if I may respond, I'm not sure if I fully agree about this case. Of course, I don't know the details, but it's about ethical standards, and I think we are entitled as European researchers to follow our own ethical standards, and we are obliged to when we get funding. But the same holds for our partners in the South. So I think this should be an exercise of rising ethical standards rather than lowering them by combining what we both find important. And in a case like this, if this is research performed not according to European standards, then there is also an issue. So I think it goes in both ways.
That's not even discussion.
But okay, I mean, it's maybe too particular to go into details.
Because it's the line between imperialism by setting our standards to a country where the standards are not existing, which is maybe to be regretted. But I think if we assign to the code of conduct, these problems should have been acknowledged already when you start writing the proposal. You know it's going to happen. You're going to work with animals, and then it should be clear before you actually set out doing it, and not at the moment that you submit a paper and then, oh, it cannot be accepted because there is an ethical problem. But I see there is it's not as straightforward as it seems on paper, for sure.
I have a question about leaving the legalistic point of view. So we talk about laws, ethical standards. Sounds that this is codified in some way by local communities, but I'm not so sure if this is the case. And when we say local communities, who are we talking about? Because if you go to a local community, you have representatives that represent the community in a formal way. There is a lot of dispute about these representatives in a very local way. So if you dig deep enough and you come to cultural differences that are so fundamental that we as moderns cannot deal with that, then how are you going to go about with research? Just a very concrete example, there is this person, Bruno Latour, most of us know him. He wrote about non-modern peoples, and they have a different view on, for example, the division between culture and nature. They see this in a totally different way. So an animist will talk to his manioc plants as if it were his grandchildren. And we will ridicule this, obviously, because it's inconceivable to us to talk into these ontological terms. So is this document just a flimsy layer of agreements that can be shared more or less between representatives from Europe and local representatives? Or should we go much further and really listen to what local communities say? And if we do that, then I think the risk for research is that you need a lot of time dialoguing, translating, talking with these communities before you can even think of doing research. So that's a question for me.
The implications in terms of implementation for research. Okay, yeah, it's open to the floor. We can respond, we can...
Building on those mechanisms, does the document allow for sandboxes? Like in the A Act, they talk about sandboxes to do all kinds of experimentation and then ultimately go to a system where that is accepted by the whole community or the whole group or the whole nation or whatever. Is that allowed, or is that even, they don't talk about that?
Understood the question.
So sandboxes are really experimental setups where things can be tried out.
Yeah.
And then if people think it's okay, then it can become a system which is rolled out in a broader community, in a broader setup and so forth.
The document is that if you want to do these things, it has to be agreed upon with the communities where you want to do the work with and for whom you want to work. And then there should not be any problem.
You could try that in a sandbox where you really test out whether it's going to be workable and those kind of things.
The concept and the design of all the experiments should be done together with the partners. That's what is in this document as one of the key issues.
Maybe a remark that also touches on what Laurent said. And I think if we really do take every article serious, then it does mean in reality that doing research will be more work, more time, more resources will be put in. I mean, it requires a lot from a research project that sometimes is being done partly, sometimes completely. So that's a question when we say we adopt this. Are we going to make sure that in every research project this is also taking place? And it's also something that we discussed. What kind of mechanisms then do you put in place? In the letter from the lead author, because we asked, what does it mean for you to adopt this code? What do you expect from us? And they said, well, from the moment you put on your website, KU Leuven adopts the code, then you become one of the logos on the list, and that's that. But that doesn't really feel like really taking this serious and implementing it. But if you do it, yeah, it does require a lot of things from people.
It does, and I'm not thinking about some of the aspects like participation and working with the communities. That's usually in the modern projects taken care of when you submit it. But in terms of restitution, all the findings that you made, how are you going to bring them back to all these people in the communities? And that's usually not taken care of very well in projects. Once you have the data and the papers are written with some scientists from the south together, very nice and well, but then the next step, how is it going to be brought back to, well, in my case, farmers and farming communities? That can be improved a lot, and there is usually not very much money available to do that final exercise, but next year when you go and visit those people, they ask, and what did you do with the findings of last year? We have it with our students when we go with them on a field course. They question farmers, and the farmers are very happy to give information, and the students make the report. Finished. Next year we go to the same sites, and they start asking you, well, what happened with our questions and our answers of last year, and what did the students do with all that information? And there is improvement to be made, and if the code of conduct can do this or achieve part of it, I would be very happy. But of course, I think the code of conduct is meant to weed out the main excesses of misbehavior in this discipline, I think. And there are, of course, some legal and difficult points still there, but if we can weed out all the main problems that occur every day, and I wouldn't say I plead guilty in that respect, but we also do research in the south that we can never do here, not because of legislation or anything, but first of all, there are no tropical crops here in Belgium, that's one thing, but also the labor is so much cheaper in the south, and so we can do in 1 year, Bolaji can attest this, we can do 500 trials in 1 year. Maybe with the same money here we can do 2 or 3 if we are lucky, but it's also an aspect of differences in access to resources, but we don't cross any legal limitations, and of course the data are for the south, etc., but still it helps you to reflect, well, we are doing things there that we can never do here. Yeah.
So, just as members of the advisory board, we, like Dr. Tamuka said, we did look more closely at the document, and we do appreciate the fact that such a document has been put together. It sought clearly to sort of promote research and collaboration in the broader sense of it, apart from the fact that there might be other details that would need to be fleshed up in the process. We do see clearly that there are also elements in terms of the power relations, which is something that we see that the document tries to sort of deal with that. But in trying to deal with that, it quite didn't touch it in a way that will be more appealing and more amenable to people who are in the global, south, to put it that way, but being aware that it's a very complicated term. In light of that, we have some kind of points that we put together to try to sort of raise awareness of the dimensions of the document that we think will require some more reflection, and so that we try to limit the level of imbalances and the asymmetries as much as possible, so that we are seen as people who have equal stake in the process, and that is something that we can bring along, and then something that those in the global north can also bring along, so that it's a mutual benefit for us when we engage in research. And perhaps Tamuka can now flesh up those points for us.
Okay, I think I'll touch on because you touched on I think on the implementation, we've already talked about the issue of an implementation mechanism. That is quite a bit of a headache for everybody. How is this going to be implemented? At what level? Is it just something nice to have on a website, and then you tick a box and say, oh, we comply? Or there's actually going to be proper follow-up mechanisms put in place to ensure that there is adherence to this code of conduct. So this is going to be very important in terms of its overall impact. Otherwise, if that is not put in place, then it might become debatable how it's actually going to work out. Then another issue that, that you raised has to do with the funding issue, because the code doesn't really also really clarify how the role of the funder, because some of the issues in the articles actually require the funder to be involved. Because, for example, if you're talking about you do your project, yeah, you finish your PhD, you go back, or you collect data, you go and write a publication. So who is going to fund all the other processes that come, that ensure that there's equity, there's feedback, there's justice, and so on. So the funder actually has to be addressed within the code of conduct. We felt that is a gap, because normally you just apply for a grant for a certain amount of time and you have to finish. So I think it has to, something also have to change in terms of the way grants are structured and the role of the funder in terms of funding some of these article issues. Some of these articles require the funder to be involved. Otherwise, the researchers will just say, I can't do it.
Yeah. Hello, everyone. I'm Kamal Devkota. I'm a PhD student at the Department of Earth and Environmental Sciences, doing my PhD in geography. I'm from Nepal, and before I come here, I had a chance to work with multiple universities working on the research project with the collaboration with Global South and Northern universities. After I finished my master's degree, we founded one research institute called South Asia Institute. And over the last 10 years, we have worked with multiple universities in UK, Australia, Europe, United States. And during that time, I had chance to work as a field researcher with the communities. I spent almost 6 years with communities doing research, collecting data, and interacting with them and supplying those informations to the researchers to the north. And I also had opportunities to be part of the publications. I tried by myself as well. So it was a nice experience working with that sort of North-South collaboration, but I also have some sort of critical experiences based on that works. So sometimes, all the time when I used to go to the community, I used to face a very critical and large question that what happened to us because of this research? This is the main question that my respondent used to ask to me. So one of the most important points that may go beyond this document may be how this particular research benefits to the communities. What is the direct benefit that community get from this? This is maybe a large questions, cannot be resolved at once, but sometimes we need to think about that, how those local communities who provide data, who provide their experience to the research are benefited from this sort of research. So this is the main questions that we may need to think on this document. And next point is, based on my experience over the last 6-7 years, there was a tendency, this may not be in all countries, but in Nepal what I experienced was a tendency of conducting research by visiting travel visa. We also didn't notice that earlier. I mean, because of this monitoring system in the global southern countries like Nepal is really relatively poor, where people or the legal system, they do not monitor what people are doing. But at some point we were asked by the government officials that you have multiple researchers, professors coming to your office. Are they really coming for the research, or they are coming for the tourist? Because Nepal is a touristic country. People, the professors sometimes in the summer, they go there for holiday, but sometimes they travel, they go to the community and do talk with the communities. That could be a part of research as well. So some sort of legal or administrative aspects is also to be maybe to be included in this document itself. So these are the basic points that I want to highlight here. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
like to bring up a point, maybe from a human science perspective. In Article 2 it is emphasized that it's important to also pay attention and to that research, that local communities and research participants should be included throughout the entire research process. I'm thinking about the fact that we as KU Leuven, during a number of years, we as promoters, we accompany scholars from coming from everywhere. And during the years at KU Leuven, they have access to our interesting system of LIMO, of the library, with the wonderful opportunity to have access to publications, to a growing number of online publications, and profit from this during the period they are with us. But if some of our people whom we accompany are EU citizens, we can still offer them opportunities to remain for a couple of years free scientific collaborators, and then they continue to have access and can still continue co-publishing with us for a while, etc. But if they come from other continents, this is way more difficult. And one of the challenges we see, I'm speaking from a particular faculty of theology and religious studies, but I think it's valid for others as well. Sometimes our researchers go home, and the opportunities to have access to such resources diminish if they do not, if they become rather practitioners, and so I think I read this kind of articles also as an invitation to also take care of those whom we train, even beyond the years they are with us at KU Leuven. And maybe try to expand access to the resources which we have here in our library system, etc. Thank you.
We also noted that, and I think one of our observations was, I think you are referring to long-term engagements as opposed to one of our very short-term limited engagements, where you know everything goes beyond just doing that study and it's over. So I think this is very, very important, because I think it actually allows the accruing of benefits over time, and even also discussing how implementation of findings and things like that. Because if you just do a study and go away, and then there's no other communication or engagement thereafter, then even all the other articles become very limited in terms of implementation. Yeah, so yeah, it's one of our observations that we make.
Back to the benefit to local communities. 2 points. I think this is something that also plays here. I mean, if patients are involved in a clinical trial, they oftentimes also complain, what happened to my data? So it's not a problem that only occurs in low resource, whatever you want to call it, countries. It's a general problem. And the way it's generally solved here is to tell these people that their contribution to a clinical trial or study, whatever, will benefit the entire group that they're part of. They are not going to, they do get some benefits from participating in some trials that are directly for the participants, but in general, the idea is not of this study or this trial to just help the people who participate, is to help anyone who has similar circumstances. Then as to funding, there is increasing interest and also funding for dissemination. So as part of the project, you can actually propose and get funding for these kinds of activities. Not necessarily after the funding's over, and that's a general problem with almost any funding agency, that if you spend money after the project is finished, basically it's not eligible anymore for financing. So, but again, that's not a problem that is just applicable to these North-South collaborations. It's a general problem.
Something extra, of course. We are all involved in university type of research, which means there are some basic fundamental aspects that are not immediately transferable to practice, which is also something where we always have to walk a very thin line between what we want to do and what is termed acceptable for a PhD. It should be something new, beyond the immediately applicable, and yet you work with communities that require or want from you some practical results, which is not always an easy exercise.
Thank you. So I think I'm probably the only person in the room who doesn't have any experience with research, which might be, yes, approaching it from a different angle. I'm the student representative at the council. I think having read the code of conduct and having gone over it, the points that were made here were important, constructive criticism on how, if we implement it, we can also look at the guidelines that we put in place, how they can be a bit more flexible to help, put this in place, because obviously there will be cases where you don't have the structures or you don't have everything clear cut. But in general, what we see in the code of conduct is it is based on some good principles on cooperation and addressing the imbalance of power, and it's also forward-looking a bit for the future. So in some cases you may not have, for example, communities who will interact with you. But what we want to see as this develops is that these structures will be built, and when they are built, because we seek to see these communities to make this progress and become more active in the science world, that we are still able to interact with them based on a code that we already have. So these would be my 2 cents.
In my opinion, the more critical article in the code that kind of goes a bit against the principle of equity, because it prioritizes restrictions and regulations in high-income countries over low-income countries, which I think is maybe the case a lot of the times. For example, animal research, maybe you have more regulation in Europe than in other places, but I think there's this assumption that rules and regulations made in Europe are somehow morally better than rules or regulations made in lower income countries, that I don't think is always the case. And it's maybe a little bit too restrictive.
Members of the advisory board who have something to add to the discussion, if you like. Sorry? Oh, yeah. Just that it would be interesting to, or not, and then we.
Maybe it would be very interesting to cite point by point.
Okay.
It will be very clear.
Okay. Then the floor goes back to Tamuka as the voice.
As the advisory board, I think we can just highlight a few points. I've already spoken about most of them during the session. We appreciate the initiative as a very important initiative to promote equitable research. Of course, issues of terminologies are about resource poor, in terms of definitions, in terms of the code of conduct, might need to be revised. We can use things like low, medium income countries and high income countries. During this discussion, the issue of guidance mechanisms for implementation was mentioned. How is this going to be implemented? And how does this go about? And I think this is a question that keeps circulating. How do we implement this from the examples that we are hearing? I talked just now about long-term engagements that are better in terms of giving feedback and ensuring that both partners, including those in this global south, don't feel disadvantaged by the collaborations. And another observation which we made was the need for emphasis that regardless of having the code of conduct, there'll always be the human factor, where the researcher in the Global South will always be in a vulnerable position from the onset. They've got very little bargaining power in terms of, because they don't have the resources. So at the background of everything else, there'll always be that. And we also have to be very careful. Even if KU Leuven chooses to adopt the code of conduct, we always have to look at that hidden factor in the background in terms of implementation, because sometimes you're just happy to receive the funding. That's the honest truth. And you are also sometimes also prepared to let go of certain ethical practices because you just want the funding to come. So I think that also aspect has to be something that's taken aware of. And in the implementation of the code, we cannot determine how that will turn out, because now these are human factors now. But it's something that we have to be aware of, that there's that underlying factor that you are vulnerable, always. And then, of course, we talked about the role of the funder, emphasizing that it's important that the funder plays an important role, because they are responsible also for some aspects of the articles. The researcher will just follow the guidelines they're given for their grants. So the funder also has to play or participate also in the Global Code of Conduct. It cannot just be left to the researchers who are applying for grants and the participants. Otherwise, it becomes very difficult to implement some of the issues that are highlighted within the articles. Say, for example, if there's a restitution that should be implemented, who's going to do that? So it becomes very, very important that the Code of Conduct does not exclude the funding agencies. So I think overall, these are our main observations as the advisory board. And I don't know if there's still any other contributions. The floor is still open. You're still open to make contributions to the discussions. Is it?
Balance, I think one should not exaggerate. I mean, obviously, in monetary terms, obviously there is a difference. But in terms of resources, because we're talking resource-poor countries, we go there because of their resources. They have resources that we don't have here. They have biodiversity that we don't. So they have potential to do things that we cannot do here. So resource-poor what? I mean, we go there and they have something that we don't have that they can contribute. So I don't think one should exaggerate this imbalance. I think there is room for them to say, look, we have things that are of value to you, and you have things of value to us. Okay, there can be a possibility for an equal partnership.
Up their game in terms of negotiation.
Well, okay.
Yeah, I'm hearing what you're saying. I get your point. Yeah. We can respond.
Of course, I return to the European Union because I know exactly what's about the evolution the last year in the ethics review panels. I am a member of there. And the thing is, I don't know exactly if you have an additional element to the requirement, the current requirement of the European Commission, for example, the European Union today or not. For example, the Horizon projects are really restricted on the ethics point of view. And the other question is about what could be the impact on the academic people, because perhaps, as you know, people can go to the private sector, or if you, as you know, journalists applies other different ethics rules outside than inside Europe. And you can see now in Turkey or Syria. And can be counterproductive if now we accept an extra element beyond the European Union's law or not. can happen, you know, as the private sector, for example, or if you work in Senegal doing research about the fisheries, small-scale fisheries, etc. But people can go directly with the Chinese or directly with the other people, and the result could be worse and not better, in fact. Thank you.
So you want to react?
Final word?
No, he wants to.
Well, yeah, I think these are the important questions to look into. As mentioned before, once a funder sets ethical standards, then of course we have to adhere to these ethical standards, and yeah, we have to be careful using that, but at the same time comply with where we go to, and make sure that we, by our standards, do not violate other standards. So I think this is a point of attention. That being said, I think that the way Europe has been evolving with respect to research ethics and also conduction of research, issues like dissemination, as was already pointed out, but also on opening up all the data is something that we have very high up in our standards now. There is this open science, open data policy where we all have to adhere to. So we have to make sure that whatever we research is open for everybody who wants, of course with a good reason, access to the data. So in that respect, I don't really see conflicts. I fully support the issues that the advisory board has given, like what to do with the human factor, and to take that into account. But I think that would be the strength of adhering to such a code of conduct, that we upfront as researchers think about how our relation will be with our partners in the South. And of course we only do this research because we need a partner in the South, and that should be recognized and valued also. And the ambition of having equal partnerships, I think, needs to be strengthened by a code of conduct like this one, or like some implementation measures that we already now have in some of the calls. So I think, well, it requires, of course, lots of work to see how implementation would work, what the legal consequences are, but on the concept itself, I think it's worth doing a good exercise.
Leuven side. There is an intention from KU Leuven side.
I'm not speaking for KU Leuven at this point. Just
neither do
I. But I'm sure we can put this on the agenda. I think this is for your council to take up the advice of this meeting, but also of the advisory board, and then we will see how it proceeds.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Exactly. We've been talking about punctuality. Maybe one point, Wouter, would you like to just mention it's about the Nagoya Protocol, a workshop you'll be having, a related topic, given some publicity time.
Yeah. Hi, thank you. So I'm Wouter van der Velde. I'm from the Research Coordination Office, and I would like to use this moment to promote our upcoming Nagoya Protocol info sessions. So I heard biodiversity, helicopter research, so this is relevant for many of the people in the room. So the Nagoya Protocol is relevant for researchers that utilize biological materials, so genetic resources in their research. And in short, every country has sovereign rights to those genetic resources. So if you want to use them in Belgium, you have to comply with a certain law. And to make our researchers aware of what is needed, we are organizing both introductory info sessions, as info sessions for more experienced researchers, so that have problems with specific topics related to the Nagoya Protocol, so utilization, specific provider countries. It was mentioned this morning in the My KU Leuven email to staff, so you can find more information over there. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Professor Tamuka. Thank you, Professor Meijers. And thank you to the audience. En nu zijn de broodjes op, zeker. Ja.